This conference will now be recorded.
So in yesterday's session, we have installed or we have configured Kubernetes cluster, self-managed Kubernetes cluster. I hope all of you are able to set up Kubernetes cluster. Are you guys facing any issues, challenges to configure the Kubernetes cluster? Okay, good. So last two sessions, we discussed what is Kubernetes and its architecture, what are the components in the master, what are the components in the worker. Now, we'll try to understand the Kubernetes components, how we can deploy the applications in Kubernetes. So Kubernetes, we call it as a Kubernetes resources or workloads or objects, all are same. We call it as Kubernetes resources or Kubernetes workloads or Kubernetes objects. Like we have a node, we have a pod, we have a service, we have namespace, we have replication controller, replica set, daemon set, deployment, persistent value, claim. Like this, we have some Kubernetes objects, Kubernetes resources. So don't get confused and don't be shocked by listing all these resources. We'll try to understand what is what, one after the other. What is node basically? What is node? Node is basically, it's a server. It's a server. It can be a virtual machine, or which can be a physical machine. It's a server. It can be a virtual machine or it can be a physical machine, right? It can be a master or worker. It can be a master or worker which is part of the cluster. We call it as a node. Kubernetes cluster will have a nodes. That node can be either master node or worker node. So I have configured a Kubernetes cluster and I have installed kubectl also as part of this machine. Master machine also, master machine itself I have installed kubectl. What is kubectl? As I told, it's a CLI, command line interface, to interact with cluster. So let me connect to that machine. If you see, how many nodes are there as part of my cluster? Node is nothing but a server. That can be a physical machine, that can be a virtual machine. 3 nodes are there. Out of 3 nodes, how many masters, how many workers? One master, one worker, 2 workers. Now, again, same question here. Who is managing this cluster? Who is responsible for looking after the applications which is running in this cluster, looking after the nodes, what is happening in the nodes, what is happening in the containers, who is looking after the applications which is running in this cluster? Master. What if master goes down? What if master goes down? The master is orchestrating the applications, the containers in this cluster. What if master goes down? Does existing application will continue to run, or the existing application, that existing parts will go down, containers will go down? Existing. Existing application will continue to run. If something goes wrong with that application, will it be recreated? I mean to say, if pod is gone or some node is gone, will the pods will be shifted to another node without having a control plane? No. So in real time, for high availability again, do we need to have a multi-master setup? Multi-master setup. We are going to have a multi-master setup in real time for high availability in the control plane. If I go for a EKS, if I go for a managed Kubernetes clusters, who will take care about multiple replicas of control plane? I mean to say multi-master. AWS itself. AWS itself. We will have a multi-master setup. Now, I have a cluster. Cluster has a nodes, Kubernetes nodes. Now, in Kubernetes, we are not allowed to deploy the containers directly. Now I have a Kubernetes cluster. I have a Kubernetes cluster. In Kubernetes, we cannot deploy and manage the containers. Our Kubernetes will not manage the containers directly. So Kubernetes cannot manage the containers directly. Kubernetes will not manage the containers directly. So in Kubernetes, what Kubernetes is going to manage? Our containers will be wrapped up. Our containers will be managed. Our containers will be wrapped up in the form of pods. Pod. Kubernetes has a pod. So in Kubernetes, there is a concept called pod. I can call all these things. I can call all these things as what? I can call all these things as Kubernetes objects, or I can call this as a Kubernetes resources, or I can call it as a workloads. All are same. Kubernetes objects or Kubernetes resources or Kubernetes workloads, all are same. So Kubernetes objects are persistent entities in Kubernetes. So Kubernetes will use this to represent the state of your cluster. Kubernetes will use these objects to represent the state of your cluster. So this Kubernetes object is a record of intent, which means once I create this object, Kubernetes objects, does Kubernetes will constantly make sure, or does Kubernetes will ensure that object exists in your cluster? If I create these objects, these resources in Kubernetes, does Kubernetes will ensure that that object exists in the cluster? Yes. So to work with Kubernetes, to create, to update, to delete these resources, to work with Kubernetes, whether to create, modify, delete, you need to talk to the Kubernetes API. If I want to create a pod, or if I want to delete a pod, or if I want to create this replication controller, or if I want to create a deployment, I want to create a service, whom should we interact? Whom should we interact? We have to interact with API server. So to interact with API server, can I use some CLI, command line interface? What is the command line interface? kubectl. kubectl. Now, what is pod? Let's try to understand pod. As I told, in Kubernetes, does Kubernetes will manage the containers directly? Can we able to create containers directly in Kubernetes? No. So in Kubernetes, we have to, or Kubernetes will manage the pod. Kubernetes will manage the pod. So pod always runs on the node. Pod always runs on the node. What does it mean? It can be either master node, or it can be either worker node also. It can be either master node. Pods can be created in the master, or pods can be created in the worker also, or worker, master node or worker node. Pod is the smallest building block. Pod is the smallest building block or basic unit of scheduling, in Kubernetes. Pod is the smallest building block or basic unit of scheduling in Kubernetes. What is the smallest resource which we can create in Kubernetes? Is basically pod. Pod is the smallest building block or basic unit of scheduling in Kubernetes. When it comes to Docker or Docker Swarm, what is the smallest building block or basic unit of scheduling in Docker or Docker Swarm? Container. We can create a container. But here in Kubernetes, can we directly create a containers? No. So pod is the smallest one which we can schedule. We can create in a Kubernetes. So in Kubernetes, pod represents running process. Pod represents running process. So what do we have in the pod? We cannot create containers directly. In Kubernetes, we can schedule pod. So what do we have in the pod? What we can have in the pod? In Kubernetes, we can schedule the pods. We can create the pod. What we can have in the pod? Inside the pod, we can have the container. We can have the containers. Pod is a logical unit of one or more containers. Pod is a logical unit of one or more containers, which means inside the pod, it's a logical group, logical unit. Pod is a logical group or logical unit of containers. So pod contains what? Inside a pod, what we can have? We can have one or more containers. So it's a logical grouping of containers. Now if I create one pod, if that pod has multiple containers, what is common for these containers which is running in same pod? It's a same logical group, logical unit. If I have two containers, let's say container 2 and container 1. So what is common for these containers which are running in the same pod? The resources, the resources, the resources, whatever has been allocated for this pod, which is common, which means the containers which are running in same pod will have same IP, storage, network, and any other specifications. So if I have more than one container in a pod, the storage, the network, the storage space, network space is common for these containers which are running in one pod. Now, each and every pod will have an IP address. In Kubernetes, each and every pod will have an IP address. Now, if I create one pod which has two containers, is IP same for both the containers? For this container, is IP same? Yes. It is going to share same network and storage space. Now, since it is sharing same network space, can I have two containers with same port inside one pod? Can I have something like this, two containers which are on same port? Can I have something like this? Is it possible? Since it is sharing same network space. It is sharing same network space, if you understand. It is sharing same network space. If it is sharing same network space, does port conflict will come? Can I run two containers in same pod with same port? Can I have this container on 8080, another container also on 8080? Is it possible? Since it is sharing same network area, same network area, network space. It is sharing same network area, network space. So in that case, can we have two containers with same port inside the pod? No. It can have different, But can I have something like this? Let's say this is different. Some container which is running on different port. Just to give an example. Can I have something like this? This container runs on 8080, this container runs on 1990. Yes. Same container. Here we can have a multi-container pods or single container pods. Now, sometimes in the interview they are going to ask how one container can communicate with other container which is running in a same pod. This application, this process want to communicate with this application, this process, both are running in a same pod. How can they communicate? Since they are running in same network space, will they able to communicate using local host? Something like this. If this process, this application, this container want to communicate with this one, can it communicate using local host? Since both are running in same network space. Do they need to depend on pod IPs? Do they need to depend on pod IPs? Do they need to use pod IPs if this has to talk to this or this has to talk to this? Do they need to use pod IP or node IP if this application want to communicate with this application? which is running in same pod, not required. Local host. They can use local host. Now, and what is also common, if I am using some value, if I am mounting some storage to this pod, can we access this storage? Can we access this storage from both the containers which are running in this pod? Suppose I have created one value, one storage is attached to this pod. Can these containers will be able to access this value which is running in this pod? Value, storage. Does this container also and this container also will be able to access this storage? But I need to mount. That is there, but can we access this storage from both the containers or all the containers which are running in same pod? Yes. So storage is common and network is common, but you need to mount, that is different. And also, will I able to restrict how much CPU, how much memory it can take? That is at a container level. How much CPU, how much memory this container can take, I can limit. There is a concept called resource request and limits. We can apply that. Now, in Kubernetes will manage the pods. It will not manage the containers directly. But inside the pod, at the end of the day, inside the pod, what we have? Inside the pod, you have a container. You can have a container, one or more containers. Now, pod is basically group of one or more containers which will be running on some node. Let's say I am creating one pod with two containers. Let's say I am creating one pod with two containers. Is it going to work like this? I am creating one pod with two containers. Does that pod will be spread across multiple nodes? Does that pod will be spread across multiple nodes? Which means I am creating two pods, one pod with two containers. So does the container one run in one system? Does the container two runs in another system? Does the pod spread across multiple nodes? No. So if I create a pod, if I have a pod with two containers, does the both containers will be running in same node? Some node. If I create one pod which has a two containers, does both containers runs on the same node for that pod? Yes. So pod can contain one or more containers which will be running on some node, right? Each pod will have its unique IP address. Does each pod will have a unique IP address in the cluster? Each pod will have its unique IP address in the cluster. Pod is abstracting network and storage away from the underlying containers. Pod is taking or abstracting the network and storage away from the underlying container. Again, any data saved inside the pod, I mean to say inside the container, will it disappear if the pod is deleted and recreated? Without using values, if I create a pod, if pod is deleted and recreated, do we lose the data? Yes. We need to use values concept again. Now, if you see this diagram, let me enlarge this diagram. If you see this diagram, let me enlarge this. So this outer circle, what is this outer circle? This represents node. Within the node, what we can have? What is this? What is this circle? Within the Kubernetes nodes, what we can schedule? What we can create? We can create pods. Within the pods, what is this what is this box? Within the pod, what we can have? We can have a container. We can have a container. This is just container. What is this? Can I use volumes for those pods? Volumes for those pods. Single container pod. Can I call this one as a multi-container pod, which means two containers, multi-container pod? Can I call this one as a multi-container pod? We will have a multi-container pod, single container pod, multi-container pod. Now, we are going to create pods. Pod will have a containers. But most of the cases, pod model types, most of the cases, you see what type of pods? We'll see. Most often when we deploy a pod to a Kubernetes cluster, it will contain a single container. But there are some cases, instances, you might need to deploy a pod with multiple containers. So there are two types of containers. We will have one container per pod, which means single container pods. In this model, pod is the wrapper of a single container. So inside the pod, you will have only one container, single container. But in some scenarios, some use cases, you will have a multi-container pod, or we call it as a sidecar containers. Multi-container pods, or we call it as a sidecar containers, or helper containers. Sidecar or helper containers. Multi-container pods, or sidecar containers, or helper containers, all are same. So in this model, pod can hold multiple containers. Pod can hold multiple containers. Again, will those containers will be co-located? If I have a pod with multiple containers, will those containers will be co-located? Co-located in the sense, does those containers will be running on same node wherever that pod is scheduled? Same node wherever that pod is scheduled, right? So we will have some use cases where you will have a multi-container pods. What type of applications? Let's say, let me take this one. I have a Spring Boot application. I have a Mongo database. So I have a Spring Boot image, that application image. I have a database image. Does it mean, is it recommended to have these two containers in a same pod? Does it mean, is it recommended to have Spring Boot image, I mean to say Spring Boot container and database container in a same pod? Does it mean, can I have these kind of use cases as a multi-container pods? Are you getting my question, guys? Now we have a Spring Boot application that has one image, application image, and I have a database, Mongo image, which means, can I have a pod with those containers? Does it mean, can I deploy this way? Even though Kubernetes allows, we can have a multiple containers in a same pod. Can I have something like this? If you think, if you understand correctly, Can I have something like this? No. This is not the use case where you can have a multi-container pods or helper container. What is the problem if I have something like this? Whenever there is a change in the Spring Boot pod, I mean to say Spring Boot application, if I try to reapply this pod, will it be deleted? Will it be stopped? Will it stop? Does Kubernetes stop this container since which is running in same pod? Is it going to be deleted and recreated this complete pod? If there is a change in this application, I want to deploy this image, is it going to completely remove this also and redeploy? Yes. So this is not the use case. Multi-container, sidecar container. Sidecar is nothing but a helper. Suppose you have some use case. You have some use case like this. You have main container. You have some main container. You have some main container which is running, which is doing some functionality, and it is require some helping hand. It is required some helping hand. So instead of writing that enhancement, it requires some helping hand, some kind of a enhanced functionality. Instead of writing that also in a same code, I can have a separate code, separate container. Let's take this use case. Let's say I have one, my use case is this application, this container is trying to read the data and write the data to database. So I have a use case something like this. Use case is something like this. Use case, read files from external sources, then process those files and insert into database. This is my functionality. This is my use case. Read files from external sources and process those files and insert into a database. So this is my main process. Now, can I code everything into a single project? I mean to say single code base, single image. Can I code this one also into a same code base? Can I also write this one also into a same code base, which means same project, same code base? I can do that way also. Or I can use another approach in Kubernetes. This is a sidecar or helper. What I can do, instead of writing everything into a same code base, I can write this one as a separate code, this one as a separate code. Now, this is my main process. This is my main process. This is my helper. So it will read the files from external sources like NFS or S3, like S3 or EFS, something like this, some external sources, or some from some FTP locations. I can write this one as well as this one in a single code. But let's say in future, I want, instead of S3, I want to read data from something else. Instead of S3, I want to read the data from something else. If it is in a same code base, do I need to touch this application? I mean to say, this process also needs to be updated, correct? So instead of doing this way, in Kubernetes allow us to deploy multiple containers as a single logical unit called pods. That way, can I write something that requirement into two different applications? This application will read data from external sources, and it will just process those data. It will process that files and insert into DB. Let's say I have this use case. Now I can write some code which will read the files from external sources, and other application, other container will process those files. If I deploy those together in a same pod, let's say this is my helper. Let's say this is my helper. Can I have some code which will read the data from outside? I mean to say from external sources like S3 or something else. This helper container, that helper application, can read the data from outside. Can this make it available to the volume which is attached to that pod? It will read the data from outside and it will write those files into the volume, that storage, which is attached to that pod. Then this main process, this main container, does this container also can access the files which is part of the storage? As I told, storage is common for the containers which is running. As I already told, what is common for the containers which is running in same pod? Will they able to access the storage? This container can write the files. This container can read the files. This helper container can get the files from outside and maintain in the storage attached to that pod. This container, will it able to read these files from this value instead of knowing from where it is getting? Does this main container has to know from where those files are coming? Does it need to have the logic to read those files from outside this main container, this main process? Does this main process has to know, or does it request to have a logic to read the files from outside that can be from anywhere? Not required. So this helper container is doing that logic. It is taking the files from outside and keep it in the storage. This container can take the data from the storage and process. Now let's say tomorrow there is a change. Instead of S3, it has to take the files from some FTP location. Do I need to update anything in the main application, that main process? Do I need to update anything in this main application, main process, that main container? Or can I just change this helper container logic? Do I need to just change this helper container logic to get the files? Instead of S3, it has to read from some FTP. In that case, do I need to change my main application logic, main container logic? This is very, very important. Advanced features we have in Kubernetes. This main container doesn't know from where the data is coming. There is a helper. This is helping this main container. Do I need to update this main container logic? Tomorrow, if I want the data to be read from FTP instead of S3, do I need to update this main container logic? Not required. This helper is doing that. I can just update this helper, this logic, this container logic. So we will have some use cases. Multi-container pods or sidecar containers, we call it as. A pod can hold multiple containers, a primary container and utility container. That utility container, we call it as a helper container. Utility container that help or enhance how application functions. It will help. This helper container will help the main container. It will enhance how application functions, like helper containers, right? Some examples I can say. Suppose this main application, this main container is generating lot of logs or lot of files it is generating. Can I have some helper container which will take the logs from this main container and send it to somewhere else? Let's say this is my main application, main container. It is generating lot of logs. Can I have one helper container which will process those logs and send somewhere else as a helper container? Or we can have a proxies, network proxies as a sidecar. You can enhance the functionality of your application without touching this application with the help of helper container, like log shippers, monitoring agents. If you want to monitor this container, this application container, then you can have that agent as a sidecar. That agent have a sidecar or helper. So this is how you can have a multi-container pod, sidecar containers. As I already told, what is common for the containers which are running in same pod? Is it going to share same network and same storage? Yes. As I already told, one container has to communicate with other container which are running in same pod. Then how they can communicate? If they are running in a same pod, they are sharing the same network space, will they able to communicate with local host? This one will be able to communicate with this local host. Local host. So pod is a logical unit of containers. Pod is a logical unit of containers. If there is a issue with this container, if this container process is not running within that pod, who is responsible for making sure that this container is up and running? The kubelet. The kubelet which is running in that node. The kubelet which is running in that node, it is responsible for making sure that these containers are up and running. But if there is a really issue with pod, I mean to say some node goes down or I need to recreate the pod, then that will be done by Kubernetes, that master. Master. Now we have these containers, single container pods, multi-container pods. Before I create a pod, let me explain one more important concept, important question called static pod. We have we have a normal pods, we have a static pods. We have a normal pods, we have a static pod. So sometimes in the interview they are asking this question also, what is static pod? Anyone has any idea what is static pod? This is also one interview question. What is static pod? Anyone has any idea what is static pod? Right? In simple terms, static pods are directly managed by kubelet. Static pods are managed directly by kubelet. Kubernetes doesn't have any control on static pods. Static pods are the pods which is directly managed by the kubelet, which is running in that node. Kubernetes, that Kubernetes API doesn't have any control on the static pods. So static pods will not be managed by, or static pods will not have any controllers like replication controller, replica set, or deployment, or daemon set. So static pods will not have any controllers like replication controller, replica set, deployment, daemon set like this. Static pods are directly managed by the kubelet. Kubernetes API doesn't have any control on the static pods. If something goes wrong with static pod, who will recreate those static pods? If something goes wrong with static pod, who is going to recreate that static pod? Directly that kubelet. So we have a static pods. Static pods are managed directly by the kubelet. The API server does not have any control over these pods. Who is responsible to watch the static pod and restart if that pod goes down? Who is responsible? The kubelet. If the static pod running on a node, the static pod running on the node are visible to API server, we can see the static pods with the help of API server, but cannot be controlled by API server. The static pods will not have any controllers like replication controller, replica sets, deployments, daemon set. Then who will watch and who will restart if the static pods goes down? As I already told, the kubelet. Now, what is the use of these static pods? What type of applications will be running as static pods? The main use of static pods is to run the control plane components. If you observe, is API server also running as pod? Is etcd also running as a pod? If you see, is API server running as a pod? If you see, is API server is running as a pod? If you see, is control managers are running as a pods? The scheduler is running as a pod, and etcd is running as a pod. If you observe, for these pods, etcd, API server, control manager, and scheduler, do we have any controllers like deployment, daemon set, or stateful set? Now if you see core DNS, these core DNS pods are managed by which controller? If you see, these core DNS pods are managed by which controller? Do we have a deployment? Do we have a deployment called core DNS, which is managing these two pods, two replicas of that core DNS? This core DNS. Can I call these pods as a static pods? Can I call these pods as a static pods? These core DNS pods? Because of we have a controller. This is managing those pods. Can I call these core DNS pods as a static pods? Or can I call this kube proxy? These kube proxy pods as static pods, because these pods are managed by Kubernetes APIs, Kubernetes objects. So these core DNS pods are managed by deployment, Kubernetes deployment. These kube proxy pods are managed by daemon set. I will explain all these things later. What is daemon set? What is deployment? What is the problem with pod? Why we should not create pods directly? I will explain that later. First, try to understand what is static pod and what is normal pod. So there is a daemon set which is managing these pods. So can I call this as a static pods, this kube proxy pods? No, this is not a static pod. Can I call this viewnet? Can I call this viewnet pods as a static pods? No, this is managed by this daemon set. But if you see, do I have any object or any Kubernetes resource which is managing this API server, control manager, scheduler, etcd? Do I have any pod, I mean to say any controller here which manages this API server, control manager, scheduler? No. Which means, can I call this as a static pods? This etcd pod, API server pod, control manager pod, scheduler pod. Can I call these 4 pods as a static pods? Because does Kubernetes will be able to manage itself? Does control manage, I mean to say, does control pane can control themselves? Can control manager can control themselves? If you understand this correctly, if something goes wrong with API server itself is managing Kubernetes. If something goes wrong with API server, does it able to recover himself? Does it able to manage themselves? No. These are managing the cluster. This API server, control manager, scheduler, etcd is managing the cluster. If something goes wrong with this thing, will it able to recover? Will it able to repair themselves? No. So who is looking after this Kubernetes control plane? Who is managing these control plane pods? Who is looking after these control plane pods? This is directly managed by, these are managed by kubelet, which is running in that node. Which means, can I call these 4 pods as a static pods? That control manager pods? Yes. Now, if something goes wrong, don't delete, guys. Don't delete, but I am intentionally deleting. I am deleting this, API server intentionally. I am deleting this pod. I am deleting that pod intentionally. I am deleting that pod intentionally. That API server itself is gone. But if you see, can I get again immediately that API server pod? So who is looking after this control plane pods? Who is looking after this control plane pods? The kubelet which is running in that node. So what is the main purpose of static pods? What is the main use of static pods? The main use of static pods is to run self-hosted control plane. Don't worry, guys, I will cover all these things. What is the -n kube system? First, focus on what I am explaining. I am going to explain each and every topic in detail. No need to worry, just focus on what I am explaining now. Understand what is static pod, what is normal pod. As I told, I will explain namespace. What is that namespace? Now, the main purpose of static pod is to run the control plane. If required, can I create static pods on my own? Is it possible to create a static pods? Is it possible to create a static pods on my own? Yes, we can create. So where we can create those static pods? How can I create those static pods? If I want to create my static pods, suppose I want to create a static pods on this node, in the master node. Does each and every node has kubelet? Does each and every node has kubelet? Yes. So if I want to create a static pods on this node, if I want to create a static pods on this node, there will be a folder called etc Kubernetes manifests. there will be a folder called etc Kubernetes manifest. In this folder, I need to create my pod YML. I need to create my pod YML in this folder. So the moment I create a pod YML in this folder, in this machine, does pod will be created, the static pod will be created in this node. If I place my YML, pod YML in this folder, the static pod will be created. Yes. If you see, I already have these YMLs. What is this YML? What is this YML? What is this YML? Do you see there is a pod YML for scheduler? There is a pod YML for control manager. There is a pod YML for API server, etcd. Now, is it recommended to delete or modify? Is it recommended to delete or modify these files? No. Now, if I want to create a static pods on these nodes, if I want to create a static pods on these nodes, then what needs to be done? Again, go to this node, SSH to this node. There will be a same directory structure, etc Kubernetes manifest. In this server, in this location, if I place my YML file, then will the static pod will be created on that node? Yes. So we have a static pods. Now, is it recommended to deploy our applications as a static pods? Are we going to deploy our pods, our application pods as a static pods? No. We will never deploy our applications as a static pods. So the main purpose of static pods is only for control plane. We are going to deploy our applications as a normal pods. If it is a normal pod, whom should I request? How can I create a pod? I don't want to deploy my application as a static pod. I want to deploy as a normal pod. In that case, what is the process of deploying the pods? Whom should we request? We have to request the API server. We need to request with API server, I want to deploy this pod with these many containers using these images. I want to deploy. We have a normal pods, we have a static pods. Does anyone has any question or query? Very important, guys. In the interview also they will ask, what is static pod? What is static pod? Is everyone clear? What is static pod? No. So far, did I deploy any pods? Did I deploy any pods? Did I deploy any application on my own? Do we have any pods on my own? No, we didn't deploy any pods. But before deploying any pod, let's try to understand namespace. Let's try to understand namespace. There is a concept called namespace. There is a concept called namespace. What is namespace? We can logically group Kubernetes resources into a namespace. We can logically group Kubernetes resources. What is Kubernetes resource? Can I call pod, service, all these things as a Kubernetes resources? Can I call all these things as a Kubernetes resources? Yes. So we can logically group Kubernetes resources into a namespaces for better management of applications, resources, and security. So we can logically group Kubernetes resources into a namespaces for better management of resources. Kubernetes, I mean to say resources, security, and teams. Let's say I have a lot of teams. I have a lot of teams working in my project. There are a lot of projects, lot of teams. Each team is developing some applications. Do we need to have some kind of a better approach to separate or isolate the Kubernetes resources of each project, each team in the cluster? Let's say I have a project A, I have a project B, I have a project B, I have a project C. Or instead of projects, let me say team A, team B, team C. So they are developing some application. Let's say they are developing this application. Let's say they are developing this application, customer care application. Let's say these guys are developing some vendor application. Now these teams want to deploy their applications in Kubernetes. They want to deploy this application in Kubernetes. Do they really need to procure? Do they really need to create a separate clusters, or can they use same clusters? Can all these teams use same cluster to deploy their application? Do they really need to have a separate clusters? Because all are Flipkart applications only. So all are Flipkart applications only. End users in the sense actual users, guys. What is the meaning of backend users? End users in the sense actual users, the real users of Flipkart. I am trying to purchase something, I will be end user. So this customer care is nothing but what? Does customer, if you have issues with your order, you call customer care. Will they have their own applications to track the orders which is placed in the Flipkart? They will have their own applications. That will be customer care applications, right? So there will be different applications for that client. Now they want to deploy these applications. Now they want to deploy their pods, they want to deploy their deployments, they want to create the volume services, all these things. This team. Do I need to manage this cluster in an efficient way? When there are a lot of teams, a lot of projects are using this cluster, do I need some way of better management the cluster, sharing the resources of my cluster with teams, applying a security for each and every team? So if there is no better management, it will be like mess up. Now my requirement is team A want to deploy their applications and team B want to deploy their applications. Team A should not have access to team B. Team B should not have access to team A. Even though they are sharing the same cluster, team A cannot modify, cannot update, cannot delete team B related Kubernetes objects. Team B should not be modified, deleted, whatever is deployed by team A. Security, isolation, right? So in Kubernetes, there is a concept called namespace. You can think of namespace as a virtual cluster inside your Kubernetes cluster. Kind of a folders, logical grouping. You can think of namespace as a virtual cluster inside your Kubernetes cluster. You can have multiple namespaces inside a single Kubernetes cluster. You can have multiple namespaces inside a single Kubernetes cluster. They are logically isolated from each other, which means if this is my requirement, can I have a namespace for this team? Let's say something like this: Flipkart end user NS. Let's say Flipkart customer care NS, vendor NS, something like this, some name, something like this. I can have a namespaces for these teams. So within this namespace, can I deploy whatever is required to deploy this application, like all the pods, deployment, services, volumes of this application? Can I create all these Kubernetes resources which is required for this application? Can I create all those things? Can I deploy all these things in this namespace? Yes. Then whatever applications, whatever Kubernetes resources I want to deploy for this one, I can deploy under this namespace. You can think of namespace as a virtual cluster inside your Kubernetes cluster. You can have a multiple namespaces inside the Kubernetes cluster. They are logically isolated from each other. So these namespaces will help us to organize security and performance. Will these namespaces will help me to organize my applications? Will these namespaces will help me with security and even performance, which means I can set how much resources can be allocated for that namespace. Now I can apply a security at a namespace level, which means the team A developers cannot modify, cannot delete, cannot create anything in this namespace. Team B developers cannot delete, cannot view, cannot modify anything in this namespace. Can I apply a security in Kubernetes at a namespace level? Yes, we can do that. And is all these Kubernetes resources which is deployed in this namespace, is it isolated from other namespace? It's a logical grouping of your Kubernetes resources. Yes. So we have a namespace concept. You can consider namespace as a logical grouping of your Kubernetes resources, which will help your teams to apply security isolation at a namespace level. Each and every project will use this concept. We are using this concept in my project. Currently, I'm working on Kubernetes. From last 3-4 years, I'm working on Kubernetes. So we are using this concept in our daily life. We are using a namespaces for isolation. So we use namespaces for isolation to split many projects, teams into a separate namespaces. This is useful for preventing cross project contamination, which means I can prevent the project A, the team A developer should not have an access to team B resources. Team B should not have an access to team A resources, Kubernetes resources. So we have this namespace concept. Now I can allocate the resources also namespace level. Let's say I have a Kubernetes cluster. Now let's say what is my cluster capacity, guys? Let's say what is my cluster capacity now? What is my cluster capacity, if you understand? Total I have how many nodes? Including master, how many nodes I have? One master and two workers. So master capacity. What is the master machine capacity? 2 GB RAM and 4 GB RAM, 4 GB RAM and 2 core processor. What is the worker? 1 GB, 1 core. What is my total cluster capacity? What is my total cluster capacity? 6 GB RAM and 4 core processor. This is my cluster capacity. Now, can I share these resources with multiple teams using namespaces concept? If I don't have that control, anyone can develop, anyone can deploy any number of pods, any number of resources they can use. I can apply or I can share these cluster resources at a namespace level. What does it mean? I can create a namespace like this, and also if required, we can set the resource quota. We can set the resource quota for that namespace. What is quota? Ration quota. Does each and every family has some quota of ration? You will get this much rice, you will get this much sugar, you will get this much oil from the government. Ration quota. Similarly, we can set the resource quota. Similarly, we can set the resource quota for namespace. What is the meaning of resource quota? If I don't set these quotas, does this team can consume complete cluster resources? If I don't set the quota for this namespace, does this team can consume complete Kubernetes resources? All the CPU, all the memory? If there is no limit, does this team can completely consume all the Kubernetes resources, whatever we have in that cluster? In that case, is it going to impact other team, other applications which is running in the same Kubernetes cluster? If this team is going to consume all the resources which is available in this cluster, does other team will be impacted? Will they run out of CPU? Will they run out of memory to deploy their pods? Yes. So to overcome these kind of challenges, to overcome these kind of problems, Kubernetes has a concept called namespaces. So namespace is a logical grouping of your Kubernetes resources. At a namespace level, what we can apply? We can apply security. We can apply security, and we can set the performance. Performance in the sense you can set the quota. Performance in the sense you can set the quota. How much you are trying to allocate as a Kubernetes admin, how much you are trying to allocate. Let's say I set the quota for this namespace, let's say like 1 GB RAM and 1 core CPU. So which means, can this team will be able to deploy the applications? Will they able to take more than this much CPU, this much memory for all the applications, whatever they are going to deploy in this namespace? Will they able to take more than this much? If I set the quota, like your ration quota, if you go to your ration dealer, if you ask 50 kilos of ration, does the ration dealer will provide you 50 kilos? No, right? There is some quota. Again, you need to request the dealer or government. I have a huge family. In recent years, I have got 2 childs. I got married, so I need more ration. You need to request so that they will extend. Similarly, if I really want to deploy lot of application, I may not able to deploy with this much quota. Then do I need to request Kubernetes administrator who is managing the Kubernetes? If this team really requires more resources to deploy their applications, do they need to request Kubernetes administrators who is managing that cluster to extend the quota? it will went through a lot of approval flows. Why do you need this much CPU? You really need this many applications to be deployed. So using these namespaces, can I have a better management of my cluster and its resources? Even though it's very simple concept, I am taking time to explain so that you can understand. Namespace is, in simple, namespace is a logical grouping of Kubernetes resources. You can think of namespace as a virtual cluster within a Kubernetes cluster. For isolation, we can apply a security. We can set the k8s performance in a namespace level. Now, if you see, as of now, how many namespaces we have? By default, NS. NS stands for namespace. In the full form, namespace. So NS stands for namespace in the short form, full form NS. How many namespaces we have by default? If you see now, 4 namespaces. So this is kube system namespace. This is kube system namespace. By default, the Kubernetes, that kubectl, is pointing to which namespace? I am trying to get all the objects of Kubernetes, all the resources of Kubernetes. By default, this kubectl, which is pointing to which context? This kubectl is pointing to which context, which namespace by default? It is pointing to this default namespace. I am trying to get all the objects. This is pointing to default namespace. Suppose if I say -n kube system, what is - stands for here? Namespace. Now I am trying to get all the objects from which namespace? From which namespace? Kube system namespace, right? So if you see, what are all these things? All these pods, is it our own application pods? Is it Kubernetes related, system related pods? What are all these things? We have a pods, we have a services, we have a daemon sets, deployments, all these things in this namespace. Is it our own Kubernetes resources, our application Kubernetes resources, our application related pods? No. This is system related. This is system related. It is not our own application. I have not deployed any application so far. This is system related. If you see, did they already isolated these pods into a separate namespace? This system related, Kubernetes related pods, its resources in a separate namespace already. It's already isolated. Now I'm using an admin user. I'm using an admin user to talk to the Kubernetes. So as an admin user, do I have a permissions to access anything in the Kubernetes cluster? We are using admin user. The kubectl is configured with admin user. So since I am an admin user, do I have permissions to any namespace, any Kubernetes resource in this cluster? Since I'm using admin user credentials, admin user, yes. Now, is it recommended to deploy our own applications in this namespace? Is it recommended to deploy our own applications? Is it recommended to create our own pods in this namespace? No. So by default, we have these namespaces: kube system namespace, default namespace, kube public. As of now, we don't have anything in this. In the kube public, the name itself is saying public. There is no access restrictions on this namespace. There is no access restrictions on this namespace. As of now, we don't have anything in this namespace, in this namespace. These are default namespaces. Now, while creating any pod or any deployment, or any replica set or any Kubernetes resource, while creating, if I don't mention namespace, in which namespace those resources will be created? If I'm creating pod, I'm not mentioning a namespace. If I'm creating some service or deployment, I'm not mentioning namespace. In which namespace it will be created? The default. Now, if required, can I create my own namespace? Can I set the quota, how much CPU, how much memory can be allocated for that? We can do that, right? So how to create a namespace? How to create a namespace? Or how to create any Kubernetes resource? Namespace is also one Kubernetes resource. Pod is also one Kubernetes resource. Deployment is also a Kubernetes resource. Like this, we have Kubernetes resource. How to create any Kubernetes resource? With the help of client. With the help of client. That can be CLI or that can be GUI. What is CLI? Command line interface. Is kubelet is a CLI or kubectl is a CLI? Kubectl. Again, lot of confusion will happen, guys. Don't get confused. Kubectl is different, kubelet is different, kubeadium is different, kubeproxy is different. So kubectl, it's a CLI. Again, there are two ways we can create the resources. One is imperative, another one is declarative. One is imperative, another one is declarative. So imperative, again, there are two ways we can create: imperative, declarative. What is the meaning of imperative? Commands, directly using command. Declarative, in the form of manifest files, in the form of Kubernetes manifest files. So that manifest files, in which file format we are going to write those Kubernetes manifest? YML or YAML? YML or YAML? Sometimes in the interview, they are going to ask one question also. Does Kubernetes supports a JSON format? Can we write Kubernetes? In the interviews, sometimes they'll ask this question also. Does Kubernetes supports JSON manifest instead of YML manifest? Yes, it supports. But do we use JSON format? Do we write Kubernetes manifest in a JSON format? 99.99% no. 99.99% we are not going to write Kubernetes manifests in the JSON format, only YML format. So imperative, declarative. Imperative in the sense directly command, something like this: kubectl create ns, that ns name, ns name, that namespace name. And you can add some labels also, hyphen label add. You can add a labels also to that namespace, something like this. And a declarative. So declarative in the form of what? Manifest file. So that manifest file, YML file, has these attributes, something like this. Kind, what kind of Kubernetes object you want to create? If I want to create a namespace, what is the kind? Kind is basically namespace. API version, each and every Kubernetes will have a API version. Each and every Kubernetes object will have a API version. In the background, it's an API. So you can use this command kubectl API resources. You can see the Kubernetes resources and its versions by executing this command. Now, if you see, all these are Kubernetes resources only. All these are Kubernetes resources. You have a pods, you have a volumes, you have a services, you have a secrets. If you see, there is a namespace. There is a namespace. So what is the kind? I can see this Kubernetes resources by executing this command. So what is the kind? Kind is what for namespaces? Kind is what you can see here. Kind is what? Namespace. Kind is namespace. This one, namespace. This one. What is the API version for that namespace? API version, that namespace v1. So that API version is v1. Metadata. Under metadata, you have a name. Can I give something like this? Some namespace, testns. Or you can give your actual name, like Flipkart, whatever, that team name, project name. In real time, you are going to give that team name or project name. I can give some namespace like this. And also, we can add a labels. What is labels here? What is labels here? Labels are basically key value pairs, metadata, data about data. We can add a labels to any Kubernetes object. Metadata, labels, data about data. Kind of some additional information. Suppose if I want to have something like this. So team name, team DL, something like this. Some additional data. Metadata. What is metadata, guys, in general? What is metadata? In general English, what is metadata? It's a data about data, right? So information. So here, let's say team name, I'm saying like Method Technology admin team, right? Team DL, I can give something like this. It's a data about data. So it's a data about data. Now, this metadata has a name, these labels. I can add the data namespace label, something like this. Using this YML, how can I create? How can I do that? Again, kubectl apply -f that manifest dot YML. We are creating a namespace like this. Using YML, I can create that file name, or using command also I can create whatever you want to do. If I just create a namespace, does it mean our application is deployed? Do we need to create the required Kubernetes resources like pods to deploy our applications? We need to create the pods. Now, suppose I have not created any namespace. Now, my kubectl is pointing to which namespace by default? Now, default namespace. Do I have any pods in this namespace? No. Now, is it recommended to deploy applications in the default namespace in real time? You are not practicing, but in real time, are you going to deploy all the applications in the default namespace? Are you going to each and every application in the default namespace? Or you are going to have a separate namespaces for each and every team project? You are going to have a separate teams, a separate projects. I mean to say separate namespaces. Now you can create something like this. kubectl create ns. Let's say something like this. This is in which way I am creating? Is it imperative or declarative? Is it imperative or declarative? It's a imperative. Declarative in the sense, in the form of YMLs, in the form of manifests, something like this. I create a manifest, and if I apply using that manifest, then can I call this as a declarative using this manifest file if I apply? Yes, right? So this is not declarative, this is imperative. This is imperative. Now, how many namespaces I have in this cluster? Now, how many namespaces we have? 5 namespaces. Now, in real time, does everyone will have access to manage the cluster, administrate the cluster, which means does everyone will have access to create a namespaces and set the quotas for that namespaces? No, only administrators, like a DevOps engineer who is responsible for managing the Kubernetes cluster. Now I have a namespace. Now, can some team deploy their applications in this namespace? Can some team deploy their applications in this namespace? Yes. Now, again, to deploy the application in Kubernetes, what is the smallest object which we can deploy in Kubernetes? What is the smallest or basic unit of scheduling we can deploy in Kubernetes is a pod. Now again, how can I create pod? Again, can I create a pod using imperative way or declarative way? Can I do it in any way, imperative or declarative? We can do that, right? But most of the time, in real time, what we are going to use? We are going to use these manifest files, declarative. Now imperative, how to create something like this? kubectl run name, your pod name, hyphen image, your image name, something like this. Hyphen image name, something like this. Imperative, something like this. In the running notes, I have given. Something like this. Not here, in this. So I can create something like this in an imperative way. Suppose I want to deploy this application. So I'm creating a pod in an imperative way. That pod, how many pods will be created, and that pod will have how many containers? Now, if I execute this command, how many pods will be created, and that pod will have how many containers? That pod will have only one container, one pod. That container will be created out of which image? That container will be created out of which image? From this image. Since I have not mentioned the tag, which version of the tag will be used? What image will be pushed? Colon latest. Now, when I execute this command, what is going to happen in the background? When I execute this command, what is going to happen in the background? Since it's a public repository, you no need to authenticate. I will explain later with private repository. Does it able to pull this image without authentication because it's a public repository? You no need to authenticate, it can pull. I will explain later with private. Now when I execute this command, what is going to happen? How it will work? Does this CLI will send a request to the API server? Does that API server will validate that request? Validate in the sense, first it will do the authentication and authorization. Authentication and authorization, which means whether whoever is requesting to create this resource in Kubernetes, whether he is a valid user or not, whether that user has a permissions or not. It will do these things. It will first validate whether whoever is requesting, whether that requester, that user is known to the system or not. And again, even though he is a valid user, then it will perform authorization. What is the meaning of authorization? Whether that user has a permissions to perform this task. Now, I am using admin user access, I am using admin user, root user certificates and users. Does admin user has all the permissions to create anything, everything in the cluster? Yes. So it will validate the request. Then once the validation is done, what API server does? That API server will persist the details in etcd. Then who comes into picture? Once the details are persisted in etcd, who comes in the picture? Who will assign the nodes to that pod, unscheduled pod? The scheduler will assign nodes to the pods which are not scheduled or unscheduled pods. The scheduler will assign the nodes to the pods. Scheduler will assign nodes to the unscheduled pods. Scheduler will assign the nodes. Scheduler will decide in which node it has to be scheduled. So by default, scheduler will use what mechanism to decide in which node it has to assign, it has to be created. By default, what is the mechanism it will use? The scheduler will decide in which node the pod has to be created by default based on the resources available in that nodes, and based on the request the pod is expecting. By default, it will assign the node. Then once the node is decided, then what API server does? That API server will inform that kubelet. The API server will inform kubelet, try to create a pod, try to create a containers for this pod. So who takes that responsibility? That control plane will communicate with whom to decide, to create a containers or pods? The node. In the node, it will be using what is the, to which process it will communicate? The kubelet. The kubelet comes into picture and create a pod. Now this is imperative. Declarative also same. Now, did I mention namespace? In which namespace this pod has to be created? No. Now, in this case, in which namespace now the pod will be created? If I execute like this, in which namespace the pod will be created? Now, if I execute like this, default. If I want to have it in a separate namespace, can I use this option? Something like this. What is -n stands now here? -n stands for namespace. Now I am saying this one. Now this resource, this Kubernetes pod, will be created in which namespace? If I use this option now, test-ns, this test-ns. Now, if you see, I created a pod, but why I am not able to see that pod when I execute kubectl get pods? Why I am not able to see that pod? It is trying to get the pods from which namespace? Default. But where my pod is created? In which namespace my pod is created? Test-ns. Now, since I am an admin user, do I have access to all the namespaces, all the permissions? Since I am an admin user, I have access to all the namespaces, all the resources. Now, if you see, do I have a namespace? I mean to say, do I have a pod in this namespace? kubectl get pods -n test-ns. I can do this way also. kubectl get pods -capital A, -capital A, or -all namespaces. So what does it mean? What is going to happen when I execute like this? Does request goes to API server to fetch all the pods across all the namespaces? Request goes to API server to fetch all the details, all the pods from all the namespaces. Now, am I able to see one pod in this namespace? Test-ns, one pod in this namespace now? Yes. I can use capital A also. Capital A. Now I have a pod in this namespace. Now, what is the meaning of this 1 by 1? How many pods I have in this namespace? How many pods I have in this namespace? One pod. What is the meaning of this 1 by 1? What is the meaning of that 1 by 1? The containers in that namespace. How many containers in that namespace we are expecting, and how many are running actually? One container. Now, in the Kubernetes, if I want to scale my application, we have to scale what? Now, instead of one replica, I want to have a 2 replicas. So in that case, what needs to be scaled? We need to scale the pod. We need to scale the pod. Instead of one pod, I need to have a 2 pods. Now, this pod, each and every pod will have a IP address. kubectl get pods -o wide. What is this IP, guys? I'm using this option -o wide, so it is displaying some additional details. What is this IP? What is this IP? What is this node? What is this IP? What is this IP? Pod IP. What is this? What is this? What is the meaning of this? This pod is running. This pod is running in which node? In which node this pod is running? In which node this pod is running? This pod is running in this node. So we just created a pod, right? So tomorrow I'll continue how to access the pods within the cluster, how to access the pods outside the cluster, what is service, what is the problem with pod, why we should not create pods directly. That we will understand tomorrow. Okay, we just understand the basic, what is namespace, what is pod. In real time, we are not going to directly create the pods. We are not going to directly create the pods. Why we should not directly create the pods? What is the problem with the directly if I create a pods? What is replication controller? What is replica set? So we'll continue tomorrow. Okay. So we created a namespace. I can allocate the permissions to these namespaces using RBAC concept. In Kubernetes, there is a concept called RBAC. We will come to that later. In Kubernetes, there is a concept called RBAC. What is this RBAC? RBAC is basically role-based access control. Basically, permissions to the Kubernetes resources. Permissions to the Kubernetes resources. Who can do what within a Kubernetes? Like in AWS, how are you managing permissions to the AWS resources? In AWS, we have AWS resources like EC2, ELB, VPC. Those are AWS resources. How are you managing access to the AWS resources? In AWS, we have a concept called IAM. Similarly, in Kubernetes, there is a concept called RBAC, role-based access control. Using this RBAC, we can manage access to the Kubernetes resources. That we will discuss at the last. First, you need to understand basics, then only you can go for advanced concepts. So first focus on what I am explaining and practice so that you can understand all the concept at the end of the Kubernetes. I'll continue tomorrow, guys. We just created a pod. We have not done anything. So tomorrow I'll continue from here. First of all, if you don't have done the Kubernetes cluster setup, at least set up by today itself. Try to create a Kubernetes cluster so that you can practice from tomorrow. Okay. Thank you, guys. That's it from my side. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll stop the session for today. We'll continue tomorrow. Guys, Kubernetes is very, very important. Don't expect a job or don't expect at least a better package, better opportunities without learning Kubernetes. Kubernetes is very important in DevOps lifecycle. Each and every project nowadays, whatever is being implemented, all the projects are started using Kubernetes. There is a lot of demand. There is a lot of growth, better packages you will get, better opportunities you will get if you know the Kubernetes. We are trying to cover Kubernetes as much as possible in and out of Kubernetes. I am trying to cover what is happening in the background also. When I am requesting, when I am executing kubectl, what is happening in the background, so that you can understand what is what in Kubernetes. I am trying to focus in and out of all these topics. You need to understand all these concepts, apply these concepts. I am trying to explain what I am doing in my project, daily life. In my real-time project, what I am trying to do as a Kubernetes developer or administrator. So try to utilize these sessions effectively. If you have any issues, any queries while practicing, post your queries in the Skype group. Okay. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. So someone is saying I have a problem with firewall creation as I have not practiced in AWS. Follow my video, open the security group, go to the security group of your server, go to these servers, whatever servers you have created, go to security, go to that security group. 1 second. You can follow my first video, or if you have a problem with your ports or security groups, go to those servers. your Kubernetes, whatever servers you have created, go to that server, go to the security group, this security group, open a firewall like this. Click on the security group. Same for other machines also, master machines also. Click on the security group, inbound rules. You click on this inbound rules. You can open like this, all traffic, all the ports for this range. Otherwise, if you are feeling it difficult, you open all the traffic for everywhere. But is it recommended in real time? No. But for practicing purpose, you can do that. You can open for everywhere. But it is not recommended in real time. For practicing, you can do that. Refer the videos, guys, so that you can understand. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. I'm stopping the session. We'll see you tomorrow.